November 16, 1957. Plainfield, Wisconsin. Population, 700. It was a cold Saturday evening, the kind of evening where the wind cuts through your coat. And the fields lie frozen and silent under a gray Wisconsin sky. Sheriff Arthur Schley received a call that would change this quiet farming community forever. Bernice Wardens, 58 years old, owner of the local hardware store, was missing. Her son Frank had gone to the store and found it empty, the cash register open, a pool of blood on the floor, and a single spent shell casing near the door. What followed would become one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in American history. This is the story of Edward Theodore Gein, the man the world would come to know as the Butcher of Plainfield. Warden's hardware store sat on the main street of Plainfield, a modest, unremarkable building that served the farmers and families of Waushara County. Bernice Wardens had run the store for years, a well-known and well-liked figure in the community. On the morning of November 16, she opened the store as usual. By evening, she was gone. Her son Frank, who was also a deputy sheriff, arrived to find the store abandoned. The cash register had been pulled from its mount. A trail of blood led toward the back of the store. Frank Wardens immediately called his colleagues. The investigation had begun. One name quickly emerged as a suspect, a local handyman and odd-job man named Ed Gein, who had been seen at the store the previous day and had made an unsettling comment to Bernice about going deer hunting the following morning. Deputies drove 10 miles out of town along a dirt road to the Gein property. The farmhouse sat in darkness, surrounded by frozen fields. What they found inside defied everything they had been trained to understand about human behavior. The kitchen and living areas were cluttered with junk, old newspapers, tools, debris. But as deputies moved deeper into the property, they found things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the shed behind the house, they found the body of Bernice Wardens. She had been decapitated. Her body had been dressed out, gutted, and hung upside down from the rafters, like a deer carcass after a hunt. Inside the farmhouse, the horror continued. Skulls had been fashioned into bowls. Human skin had been stretched over furniture. Faces, preserved human faces, hung on the walls like trophies. A vest had been crafted from the torso of a woman, complete with breasts. A box contained 9 preserved female genitalia. The refrigerator held human organs. Deputies who entered that farmhouse that night would never be the same. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He was the second son of George and Augusta Gein. To look at him, slight, soft-spoken, with a gentle demeanor and a habit of smiling, you would never suspect what lay beneath. Neighbors described him as a quiet, helpful man. He babysat local children. He shoveled snow for elderly residents. He was, by all outward appearances, a harmless eccentric, the kind of man you might wave to on the road without a second thought. But behind those mild eyes was a mind shaped by decades of isolation, obsession, and a mother's love so consuming it had curdled into something monstrous. Part 1. The Making of a Monster. 1906 to 1945. Ed Gein's story begins not with his crimes, but with his mother. Augusta Wilhelmina Gein was a woman of fierce religious conviction and iron will. She believed that the world outside her family was corrupt and sinful. She believed that women, all women except herself, were instruments of the devil. She preached this to her sons daily, reading passages from the Old Testament that focused on death, murder, divine punishment, and the wages of sin. George Gein, Ed's father, was an alcoholic whom Augusta held in open contempt. She considered him weak and worthless. Ed's older brother Henry was 5 years his senior. From the beginning, it was clear that Ed was Augusta's favorite, and that her love for him was not a nurturing love, but a possessive one. A love that demanded total devotion in return. In 1914, the Gein family relocated to a remote 155-acre farm outside the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Augusta chose the location deliberately. She wanted to isolate her sons from the corrupting influence of the outside world. Ed and Henry were forbidden from making friends. School was permitted, but socializing was not. After school, they came straight home. Weekends were spent on the farm, under Augusta's watchful eye. The farm was not a home. It was a prison, and Augusta was the warden. Ed grew up without friends, without social skills, without any understanding of how to relate to other people. The only world he knew was the farm, the fields, and his mother. On May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were burning marsh grass on the farm property. The fire got out of control. When it was finally extinguished, Henry Gein was found dead, face down in the smoldering brush. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation from smoke inhalation. But there were troubling details. Henry had bruises on his head that were inconsistent with the fire. And Ed had led deputies directly to Henry's body in an area that had not yet been searched. Authorities accepted Ed's account without further inquiry. The case was closed. What is known is that in the months before his death, Henry had begun to criticize Augusta, to suggest that her hold over Ed was unhealthy. It was the one thing Ed Gein could not tolerate. Henry was 37 years old. Ed was 37. With Henry gone, Ed was alone with his mother, exactly as Augusta had always wanted. In 1944, Augusta Gein suffered a series of strokes. Ed nursed her devotedly, caring for her with a tenderness that those who knew him found remarkable. On December 29, 1945, Augusta Gein died. She was 67 years old. Ed was 39. With her death, Ed Gein lost the only person he had ever loved. And the only person who had ever given his life meaning. He sealed Augusta's bedroom and the upstairs of the farmhouse, preserving them exactly as she had left them. He lived alone in the kitchen and a small side room for the next 12 years. Biographer Harold Schechter later wrote, "He had lost his only friend in one true love. And he was absolutely alone in the world." What happened next was the inevitable consequence of a mind left entirely to its own devices. A mind that had never been taught how to grieve, how to connect, or how to be human. Part 2. The Descent into Darkness. 1945 to 1957. Beginning in 1947, Ed Gein began making regular nighttime visits to local cemeteries. He would read the obituaries in the local newspaper, identify recently buried women who resembled his mother in age and build, and return to the cemetery after dark. He later told investigators that he was in a dissociative state during these visits, that he did not fully understand what he was doing. Over the course of nearly a decade, he visited at least 9 different cemeteries in Waushara County. He exhumed an estimated 40 bodies. He fashioned skulls into bowls. He stretched skin over lampshades and wastebaskets. He created what investigators would later describe as a woman's suit, a garment made entirely from human skin. In an attempt, psychiatrists believed, to literally become his mother. He kept a collection of preserved heads, organs, and body parts throughout the farmhouse. And through all of it, he continued to live quietly in Plainfield, babysitting children, shoveling snow, and waving hello to his neighbors. Grave robbing, as disturbing as it was not enough to satisfy whatever drove Ed Gein. In December of 1954, Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old tavern owner in the nearby town of Pine Grove, disappeared. A pool of blood and a spent shell casing were the only evidence left behind. Her head was later found at Gein's farmhouse. 3 years passed. Then, on November 16, 1957, Bernice Wardens disappeared from her hardware store in Plainfield. She was 58 years old. She was found that night at Gein's farm. These were the only 2 murders Ed Gein ever confessed to. But investigators who examined the evidence at his farmhouse were not convinced that the body count ended there. When Sheriff Arthur Schley and his deputies arrived at Ed Gein's farm on the night of November 16, Gein himself was not home. He was at a neighbor's house, having dinner as if it were any ordinary Saturday evening. He was arrested without incident. When asked about Bernice Warden's, Gein reportedly said, calmly, "She isn't missing. She's at the farm right now." He was taken to the Waushara County Jail. Deputies returned to the farm and made the discovery that shocked the world. In the days that followed, investigators cataloged hundreds of items of evidence. From the Gein property, a process that took days and left seasoned law enforcement officers visibly shaken. The story broke nationally within 24 hours. The Oshkosh Daily Northwestern ran the headline, 10 Skulls Found in House of Horror. The Associated Press reported, Gein admits killing woman. Newspapers across the country carried the story on their front pages. America was transfixed and horrified. The town of Plainfield, population 700, was suddenly the most talked about place in the country. Reporters descended from Milwaukee, Chicago, and New York. Residents who had known Ed Gein for years struggled to reconcile the quiet, helpful neighbor. They thought they knew with the monster the newspapers described. Many said the same thing, he seemed so normal. The evidence catalog from the Gein farmhouse reads like something from a nightmare. 10 female skulls, some with the tops sawn off and used as bowls. Lampshades and wastebaskets made from human skin. A vest crafted from a female torso, complete with breasts worn by Gein during his rituals. Human faces, preserved and hung on the walls. A box containing 9 preserved female genitalia. A refrigerator stocked with human organs. Bernice Warden's severed head, found in a burlap sack. Forensic experts from the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory spent days processing the scene. They estimated that the remains of at least 10 different individuals were present in the farmhouse, though the true number was never definitively established. Part 3. Justice and Confinement. 1957 to 1984. On November 21, 1957, just 5 days after his arrest, Ed Gein was found incompetent to stand trial. Psychiatrists who examined him diagnosed him with schizophrenia. He was committed to Central State Hospital in Waupun, Wisconsin. For 11 years, he remained there, a quiet, cooperative patient who caused no problems and was described by staff as pleasant and unassuming. Then, in November of 1968, a judge ruled that Gein had recovered sufficiently to stand trial. The trial began on November 7, 1968. Gein pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. On November 14, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. Minutes later, the judge found him not guilty by reason of insanity. He was returned to Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, where he would spend the remainder of his life. Central State Hospital in Waupun, Wisconsin, was where Ed Gein spent the first 11 years of his confinement. By all accounts, he was a model patient. He worked in the hospital's woodworking shop. He watched television. He was polite to staff and fellow patients. Those who interacted with him regularly found it difficult to believe that this mild, cooperative man was the same person whose farmhouse had contained the horrors described in the newspapers. Psychiatrists who studied him extensively concluded that Gein had been shaped by one of the most extreme cases of maternal domination and social isolation they had ever encountered. He was not, they said, a man who had chosen evil. He was a man who had never been given the tools to be anything else. What drove Ed Gein? This question has occupied psychiatrists, criminologists, and true crime researchers for nearly 70 years. The consensus is that Gein's crimes were the product of a perfect storm of pathology. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and a severe personality disorder. His behavior exhibited elements of necrophilia, transvestic fetishism, and what psychiatrists described as an extreme Oedipus complex. The root causes were clear: total maternal domination, complete social isolation, and the absence of any healthy human relationships throughout his entire life. Augusta Gein had not merely raised a damaged child. She had created a psychological prison from which Ed Gein could never escape. When she died, he did not grieve in any recognizable way. Instead, he attempted to reconstruct her, to bring her back in the only way his fractured mind could conceive. The aftermath of Ed Gein's arrest devastated the community of Plainfield. On March 20, 1958, the night before Gein's farmhouse was scheduled to be auctioned, it burned to the ground. Arson was suspected but never proven. When Ed Gein was informed that his farmhouse had been destroyed, his reported response was, "Just as well." 10 days later, an auction of Gein's personal property drew thousands of morbid spectators from across Wisconsin and beyond. The town struggled with its new, unwanted identity for decades. The name Plainfield had become synonymous with horror. And Ed Gein's grave in Plainfield Cemetery, the same cemetery he had robbed, was repeatedly vandalized by souvenir hunters. His gravestone was eventually stolen in the year 2000 and later recovered by police. Part 4. The Cultural Legacy. 1960 to the present day. Ed Gein committed only 2 confirmed murders. Yet no killer in American history has inspired more fictional monsters. In 1960, director Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho, the story of Norman Bates, a mild-mannered motel owner with a pathological attachment to his dead mother. Hitchcock based the character directly on Ed Gein. In 1974, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre introduced Leatherface, a killer who wore a mask made of human skin and lived in a house decorated with human remains. Also inspired by Gein. In 1991, The Silence of the Lambs gave us Buffalo Bill, a serial killer who murdered women in order to fashion their skin into a suit. Again, directly inspired by Ed Gein. 3 of cinema's most iconic monsters. One real man. Gein's crimes did not just shock America. They permanently altered the way we think about evil, introducing the world to the concept of the monster who looks like your neighbor. Ed Gein spent his final years at Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. He was, by all accounts, a quiet and unremarkable presence. He watched television. He did crafts. He listened to the radio. He never expressed remorse for his crimes. When asked about what he had done, he spoke about it with a detachment that psychiatrists found deeply unsettling, as if he were describing events that had happened to someone else. On July 26, 1984, Edward Theodore Gein died of respiratory and heart failure. He was 77 years old. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery among the very graves he had desecrated decades before. Ed Gein committed only 2 confirmed murders. By the standards of modern true crime, he was not a prolific killer. And yet his name endures, not because of the number of his victims, but because of what he represented. He was the first killer to make America confront a truth it had not wanted to face. That evil does not always announce itself. It does not wear a mask. It does not lurk in the shadows of cities. Sometimes, it lives quietly on a farm in rural Wisconsin. And it waves hello when you pass on the road. It babysits your children. It shovels your snow. It smiles at you in the hardware store. The story of Ed Gein is not just the story of one man's crimes. It is the story of what happens when a human being is denied every tool that makes us human: to connection, love, belonging, and the simple knowledge that the world beyond our front door is not something to be feared. Augusta Gein built a monster. And Plainfield, Wisconsin, paid the price.